Hi guys, so I wanted to talk to you about Trump. So this assignment might have seemed a little bit weird to some of you, but I think it's a great way to start a class on abnormal psychology. Do you like Trump or do you hate Trump? There's really doesn't seem to be much in between with this president. So if you like him or dislike him, it's really important for you to acknowledge that bias, either for or against him, and then try to separate your diagnosis from that. And particularly if you dislike him, I think you have to be extra careful with diagnosing whether he is a psychopath or not. And this is the same in any group of people, whether it's a politician or whether it's somebody you're actually trying to figure out, is this person crazy? Now, let me just stop there. There is no such diagnosis as crazy. Psychopath isn't even technically a diagnosis, although it's something that's still used in certain psychological circles. But this next week, we're going to be looking at the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the list of official American Psychiatric Association diagnoses, which is really the gold standard for diagnosing somebody. And if you look through that book, there is actually no diagnosis as psychopath or sociopath, which is two different things. Psychopath is a term that means the classical crazy that we think of, that their mind is not working right, they're not all there. A sociopath is somebody whose mind is working perfectly fine, but they just don't really care about social consequences to their behavior. They don't care if they destroy relationships, if they hurt somebody, and so on. So we are looking at, is Trump a psychopath, which is what a lot of people have said. Is his brain not working? Is he narcissistic? That's a type of psychopath or sociopath. See, this is why we don't actually use terms like psychopath and sociopath in psychology, because there's a lot of overlap between the two, and it's a difficult label to give somebody, and a really terrible label to give somebody as well. So number one, biases. Set your biases aside and try to honestly diagnose somebody. And if you read through your discussion board, you will see that some people had a very hard time setting aside whether they like somebody or not. Just because somebody says something nasty like, oh, I grabbed a girl's pussy, which is a terrible thing to say, does not actually mean that person is crazy. It could mean he's a jerk, but it doesn't mean he's crazy. A lot of people say stupid stuff. A lot of people say horrible stuff. I just came back from Europe, as I mentioned, and somebody made a joke about a bomb and they got arrested by airport security. Does that mean that person's crazy? No, it means they're stupid, but it does not mean they're crazy. So we have to be really careful that just because we don't like somebody, that we're labeling them with a mental illness. Now, a mental illness is a whole level above stupidity, jerkiness, whatever. And it's something that's serious. You don't want to label somebody with a mental illness if at all possible. And not only is it not something that you want to label somebody with, but to label somebody with a mental illness just because you don't like them is really insulting to people who are actually suffering from mental illness. So you need to be careful that you don't let those two areas, dislike and mental illness, overlap. If you look historically, a lot of governments would label people with mental illness simply because that person spoke up against the government. Because if somebody is mentally ill, then that means we don't need to listen to them. So using mental illness in this way as sort of a weapon against people is really harmful to people who actually have mental illness. And this is why I hate the fact that people are labeling Trump as psychopath, narcissistic, personality disorder, sociopath, all of these labels that are basically proof that this is why we shouldn't like him or listen to him. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to, sorry, I keep getting notifications. That doesn't mean that you need to like Trump, whether he's mentally ill or not. That's a whole nother thing. But to use mental illness as sort of this evidence that he shouldn't be president is insulting to the mentally ill. I hope you're seeing that. And it's dangerous to label people. Like, modern society, we're all, diversity and acceptance and don't label. And yet the second we don't like somebody, we throw a label at them as a weapon to harm them. So I hope you're seeing my point there, that this using mental illness as a weapon for disliking somebody simply because you're biased against them is really bad. There was an experiment that was done with insane asylums where there was actually a journalist that her boss, and this was a woman journalist back in I think it was the late 1800s, which is phenomenal. And this was in the era of insane asylums where the mentally ill, even people who were not really mentally ill, were just tossed in because they were annoying, sort of like what we're talking about with Trump. And they were tossed into these insane asylums and locked away forever and treated really badly. And this journalist got locked into one to see what it was like to be on the inside. And then her boss had to fight to get her out because the doctor said she was actually mentally insane, and they did not believe that this was a completely sane, healthy person. Because that happened, there was another researcher who did an experiment where he went to these insane asylums and told the doctors that he was going to be putting perfectly healthy, sane people in to see if the doctors would actually be able to tell who was crazy and who wasn't. And the doctors, I think somewhere around 20% of people, they said, "Oh, this is actually the journalists. These are part of the study. These people aren't crazy." Turns out the researcher put 0 people into the insane asylums, and everybody that the doctor said, "No, actually these people are totally sane," were people who were genuinely patients in the insane asylum. So that really shows how dangerous diagnosing people and labeling people are. So you guys mentioned a lot of the ethical guidelines. Number 1, you're not trained. So if you don't know how to diagnose somebody, if you're not trained, you should not ever be diagnosing somebody with a mental illness. Even the professionals have a hard time diagnosing people. And this is one of the reasons why we have the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, because there's so much mislabeling and misdiagnosing, and it's so harmful to people to be labeled with a mental illness. This is something that will follow them throughout their life, that may destroy their lives. They may lose relationships. They may lose jobs. So I try to not give people any diagnosis at all, unless it's something that's really obvious. So a lot of therapists will actually give people the label of depression, because obviously if you've come into therapy, you're upset about life, and so you have some amount of depression. So that's sort of like the trash can diagnosis. Okay, so biases, be careful about labeling. If you're not trained, then you're not allowed to do it. Even if you are trained, one of the things is that you are not allowed to diagnose somebody that you haven't met. So with Trump, I'm going to guess none of you actually know him personally. I don't. All I know about Trump is what I've seen on the news, what I've seen on Celebrity Apprentice, with TV show, a reality TV show, which we all know is not actual reality. I know nothing about the man other than his media portrayal. Now, do you guys know, I realize he's a loudmouth and everything. Do you know if that's really who he is, or is that sort of a reality show persona that he has done in order to get attention that got him the presidency? You don't know that. I don't know that. Does he pretend to be insane? Or, well, I don't know. You might not think of him as insane, but does he pretend to be like he's going to, I don't know, he scares people into thinking he's insane. I was in Denmark recently, and I was asked by pretty much every Danish person if I thought Trump was insane. Is he insane, or is he pretending that he will go to war, create a terror war, or whatever, or attack Iran like he threatened to? I don't know. Do you know that? I don't know. Because I don't know him personally. So if you don't know somebody personally, you cannot diagnose somebody. It is completely unethical. You can't just look at how the media has portrayed somebody and say, oh, this person obviously has this diagnosis. And it's actually against the APA rules, the American Psychological Association's rules. If you are a psychologist who is a member of that association, you are not allowed to diagnose somebody that you haven't met, particularly a public figure, because we all know that public figures pretend to be this certain persona, whether they are or not. And that is called the Goldwater rule, because of Senator Goldwater. People did the same thing back then. They didn't like the guy for a lot of good reasons. And so all of these psychologists said, oh, he's obviously crazy. Well, you've never met him, so you can't really say if he's crazy or not. And just because you don't like somebody's politics does not mean that the person is crazy. Otherwise, every politician, well, maybe every politician is crazy, but you get the point, okay? Crazy is not the same thing as having an actual mental illness. And the other thing is, okay, last point, and then I'm done. So there is a fine line between mental illness and just personality, and having an extreme personality. So narcissistic personality disorder is what a lot of psychologists have diagnosed Trump with. Sorry, there's a fly bothering me. So what's the difference between having a narcissistic personality, which is not mental illness, and having a personality disorder, which is such an extreme version of the personality that now it's causing problems for you? Has Trump's personality caused him problems in life? Well, he's a billionaire with a supermodel wife, and he's the president of the United States. I'd say it's probably functioning for him pretty well. Now, you may not like it. Denmark, the entire country of Denmark does not like it, but that doesn't mean it's actually a disorder. What kind of person is going to be able to have a billion-dollar empire to be president of the United States? Somebody with a personality that they think pretty highly of themselves. So if you look through the criteria for that psychopath assessment, think about how helpful is this for being a business owner, for being president of the United States. Charmingness, being able to get people to do what you want, thinking highly of yourself, all of those. If you didn't have those, you probably are not going to be a CEO, and you certainly aren't going to be president of the United States. So that personality is actually what is required to be in certain jobs. So the question becomes not, does he have a narcissistic personality? Of course he does. But it becomes more, has it reached the level of a disorder? And a disorder means it's causing distress and dysfunction in his life. And I personally don't see that. But then again, I don't know him personally. That's the thing. It's just like Facebook. We all post all the good stuff that happens to us and none of the bad stuff. So you can judge somebody's life just based on what their posts are. So anyhow, long story short, be careful when you are diagnosing people. It's highly unethical to diagnose people you haven't met, especially celebrities or politicians or people in the media. You need to be trained. You need to understand how to diagnose somebody, because I'm guessing this is the first time you guys have ever looked at diagnostic assessments. So you have to make sure the people meet the criteria. And as most of you said, Trump does not actually meet the criteria. So whether you like him or not, he's not a psychopath.